Department of Linguistics at the University of Chicago. Before joining the University of Chicago, she was a visiting professor in modern Greek in the Department of Classics at Harvard University. Dr. Dourou holds a PhD degree in modern Greek literature from Harvard University and specializes in modern Greek literature and cultural history. Her main research and teaching interests include classical reception studies, Renaissance Hellenism, history of the Greek language, Greek modernism, and contemporary Greek cinema. Professor Dourou, please.
Σας ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ. Dr. Janos was kind enough to invite me here, and I am thoroughly impressed. I mean, you have a wonderful church and a community, and from the moment we came here with my husband, Konstantin Psmopoulos, we felt that we are really welcome. And since this is the first year I am here as a professor at the University of Chicago, I once again want to thank you for welcoming us. And I am so happy that despite the fact that the weather is so nice outside, still you came to the lecture. I am impressed by that too. Βεβαίως, βεβαίως. You are very, very generous and very kind. Today's lecture invites us into a fascinating world where Renaissance humanism, Greek patriotism, and Homeric tradition converge in a way that is both powerful and unexpected. We will focus on Nikolaos Loukanes, a charismatic young scholar from Greece. Do we have anyone from the island of Zakynthos who will be particularly proud of our author? No? Okay. Our author, Nikolaos Loukanes, in the early 16th century, was the first person to produce a printed rendering of the Iliad, of Homer's Iliad, into a modern language. And as you may guess, that language was modern Greek, right? Loukanes' adaptation, composed into a time of intellectual revival and intense political upheaval, reveals not only a profound reverence for the archaic and classical heritage, but also a striking attempt to reinterpret the legendary Trojan War through the lens of the ongoing Greco-Ottoman conflict. As we will see, Loukanes' Iliad becomes a poignant and patriotic reimagining of the Homeric Iliad, deeply embedded in Renaissance debates about history, collective identity, and resilience. Our journey will move from the grandeur of Raphael's Parnassos. Whoever has visited the Vatican may know that, the Vatican Museum. Do we have anyone who has visited? Oh, I can see two people, nice. It's a beautiful painting. We will see it shortly. So our journey will take us from the Vatican Museum, the Parnassos of Raphael, to the halls of the Gymnasio Mediceo in Rome. This is the school of our author. And from ancient Troy to 16th century Venice, with its thriving community of Greeks, just like your community here, a thriving community of Greeks living abroad. Did you know that the Greeks in Venice also wanted to have their own church? And how long did it take them to build it? 40 years, almost. Yes, it was completed in 1573. After many efforts, they were trying to convince the people there who were responsible for giving this specific permission for many years. Most of these people were stradioti. They were soldiers, and they were very successful. Of course, there were merchants as well. So, Kyria Stefane, can you hear us? We need the first slide.
I already put up the first slide.
We have it already. Thank you so much. So, rarely can someone marveling at Raphael's Homer, famously flanked by, let's see, do we recognize these people here? Dante Alighieri and Virgil in the Parnassos, adorning the stanza de la Segnatura in the Vatican Palace. Rarely can these people come to realize that one of the earliest admirers of this masterpiece of the Italian High Renaissance was in all probability a charismatic scholar from Greece, to whom we owe the first printed edition of the Iliad in a modern language. Born at the dawn of the eventful 16th century, the Cinquecento of the startling transatlantic discoveries, the ceaseless Italian wars, the vociferous emergence of the Protestant Reformation, and the unrelenting Ottoman advance into European territory, Nikolaos Loukanes, like so many of his erudite compatriots residing in flourishing cities in the West, for example, Ianos Laskaris and Markos Moussouros, and we will return to these two figures, he appears to have ardently devoted himself to humanist intellectual endeavors, aimed at instigating a revival of classical literature. Of course, at the same time, that was not his only priority. At the same time, he was responding to an unremitting longing to keep alive in the hearts of his fellow Greeks the empowering legacy of their illustrious ancestors. And if we can proceed to the second slide. So let's stop for a minute and ponder. Was there a need for a revival of classical literature? And for whom? Let's turn to a leading scholar and poet of the early Italian Renaissance, who is often credited with initiating the 14th century Italian Renaissance and the founding of Renaissance humanism. So here we see Petrarch. And if we want to read, can I have a volunteer who will read? Well, I know that my husband will definitely want to do that. But maybe someone else? Yes, please. Yes, of course. If you can read his words, where it says, your Homer. Yes?
Often as I embrace him, I say, sighing, "Oh, great man, how ardently would I listen to you."
Perfect. Thank you so much. And your name is? Thank you so much. Joanne, Joanna, Telia. So here we have the West. In the West, they don't know anything about Homer. They want to read the Iliad, but they cannot do it, right? So when we talk about the Renaissance, we talk about the Renaissance in the West. Let's see what was happening in the Byzantine Empire, the East. Unlike the West, where another professed eyewitness account of the Trojan War had totally overshadowed Homer's linguistically abstruse narrative, the expressive power of Homeric Greek never ceased to preoccupy erudite intellectuals in the Byzantine East. Authors like Evstathios of Thessaloniki and other scholars zealously took upon themselves the laborious task of producing extensive commentaries and exegetical works on the Homeric epics. And if we can move to the next slide. Τέλεια. Here we see Άγιος Ευστάθιος of Thessaloniki. Has anyone visited Mount Athos? Ο κύριος Τζάνος εδώ. Πάρα πολύ ωραία. Have you been to the Vatopedi Monastery? So maybe you have seen this. Πάρα πολύ ωραία. Αυτός λοιπόν είναι ο Άγιος Ευστάθιος Θεσσαλονίκης. My uncle happened to be a monk on Mount Athos, a different monastery, the Philotheu monastery, and I know that you have the Panagia. Panagia Glycophilousa is the Panagia from that monastery. So my uncle, when I was just very, very young, maybe 9 years old, he decided that the most appropriate gift to give me was the commentary by Evstathios. And that was a huge book. And I said, what am I going to do with that? At that point, I was intrigued, but also very challenged and overwhelmed by it. Throughout its millennial history, Byzantium continued to view Homer as the educator par excellence, and thus Homer retained a revered title, which ironically had been accorded to him by no other than the fierce opponent of poetry, Plato. Plato didn't really like poetry. If in the West, Homer's epics extended well beyond the reading competencies of even accomplished scholars like Petrarch, as we have seen, in the East, Homer still formed the backbone of the curriculum, read as he was by schoolboys and surreptitiously by school girls, because girls didn't have a proper education. But we have one, Anna Komnini. She is the daughter of an emperor, and she was very much interested in Homer. So she managed, although she was forbidden by her parents from studying classical literature, she had recourse to unofficial lessons from court eunuchs. Indeed, it is interesting to see that in Byzantium, it was customary for students to learn Homer by heart at school. Much like Nikiratos in Xenophon's Symposium, Michael Psellos, who is an intellectual and court philosopher who lived in the 11th century, could have also gloated over his ability to recite by heart the whole Iliad. This is at least what he is saying. A work that he had reportedly covered in its entirety by the age of 9. So imagine, my uncle gave me that commentary. I was 9. He was 9. He knew it by heart. How would that make me feel? Which one? The poem. This is a great question. The Iliad is written in verse, in dactylic hexameter. So yes, he was reciting in dactylic hexameter. Δηλαδή, άνδρα μιέν επεμούς απολύτροπον. He knew all of it. The Iliad and the Odyssey. Ναι. He was a really talented scholar. So, thus far, we have seen that there was a need for a revival of classical literature in the West, right? Because in the East, we had all these scholars. We can then understand why Pope Leo X, and now we can move to the next slide. Πάρα πολύ ωραία. Here we have part of this commentary. And if we can also go to the next one, Kyrie Stefane. Okay, so this is Venetus A. This is a manuscript, a very well-known manuscript, where the text of the Iliad was preserved. Because, you know, all these texts, they were preserved by Byzantine scribes. They were writing and writing again, and we have all these wonderful copies. Venetus A is the most important because it is complete. This is how we have our Iliad today. And if we can move to the next one. Πολύ ωραία. We have to thank Cardinal Bessarion for getting this specific manuscript. He acquired it and he donated it later on. Can someone read where did he give it? It's a library. Is it in Greece? Smithsonian? Όχι, 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 δεν πήγε τόσο μακριά. Ήταν πιο κοντά. Για να δούμε, μήπως ήταν Ιταλία. Όχι, όχι. Ακόμα πιο κοντά, προς Ιταλία. Βλέπετε που λέει Βενετία, βέβαια, Βενετία που είχαν the thriving community. Αυτοί είχαν και την εκκλησία. Εκεί ήτανε και αυτό. He donated it to the library there. It's called Μαρκιανή Βιβλιοθήκη. Πάρα πολύ ωραία. And if we can move to the next slide. Πάρα πολύ ωραία. This is Pope Leo X. So we can understand why Pope Leo X was so willing to support financially an institution such as the Gymnasio Mediceo, which is Nikolaos Loukanes' school, right? So Pope Leo X was the person who gave the money for that school. The young author, who was just in his 20s when he produced his adaptation of the Iliad, was born in all probability on the island of Zakynthos, sometime between 1502 and 1504. And he belonged to the first cluster of students of the gymnasium. Unlike the Pontifical Greek College of St. Athanasios, founded later in 1577, with a stridently proselytizing mission, the Gymnasio founded in Rome in 1514, our author's school, had the sole purpose of fostering Greek studies in Italy. A letter of August 6, 1513, dispatched on the Pope's behalf to Marcos Moussouros by the papal secretary Pietro Bembo, eloquently describes the philosophy of the school. The renowned Cretan Hellenist, Marcos Moussouros, is asked to bring from Greece 10 or 12, or indeed as many as he wishes, young fellows. And these fellows, they would be of plentiful intellectual abilities, clever kids, and of a morally good disposition. He believed that through their instruction, the Latins could gain a more advanced and comprehensive grasp of Greek. They really wanted to learn Greek. They needed to have some people who would be teachers. But if, for the Pope, the school had an unmistakably humanist scope, the person who was entrusted with the task of recruiting its first students, and this is Markos Moussouros, along with his mentor Ianos Laskaris, who had in the first place envisioned the foundation of such a school, they equally foregrounded its capacity to galvanize the young pupils' patriotism. And so, if we can move once again to the next slide. Ευχαριστώ. According to the dedicatory epistle to Ianos Laskaris, with which Moussouros prefaces his 1516 edition of Pausanias, let me pause to say that these people, they really wanted to produce some editions of ancient Greek authors. It was really important to these people. If you remember, many years later, of course, we have Adamantios Korais and his project with the Hellenic Library. So what we see here is a foreshadowing of that. We are not in the Enlightenment, no, by no means. This is the Renaissance, but still we can see some elements of that. So the neophyte scholars are described in this epistle as noble-born, diligent, and intellectually outstanding. These students were expected, according to Moussouros, in due course, to requite their benefactor with works in prose and verse, proclaiming the glory of Laskaris' Genos, and exalting the virtue of his ancestors, the most honorable emperors of Greece. And at this point, we need to mention that indeed Ianos Laskaris hails from such a pedigree. They were Byzantine emperors, the Laskaris family. It has been astutely observed that though carefully couched in encomiastic terms and specifically referring to Laskaris' noble lineage, this can also be taken as an implicit reference to the Genos of the Greeks in general, whose illustrious heritage they shared and were called to promulgate. One should not forget that in 1514, the year when the school started its operation, hopes for a crusade against the Ottomans were running high, and Greek scholars in Italy, such as Laskaris and Moussouros, who were privileged to enjoy the personal acquaintance and friendship of the Pope, felt an overwhelming urge to exhort the already eager pontifex to unite the Christian powers in an expedition against the Ottomans. They felt that they would be able to achieve it. So it is against this backdrop of relative optimism concerning Eastern affairs that the formal salutations addressed to Pope Leo X by the newly arrived students should be read. And let's move to the 7th slide. Πάρα πολύ ωραία. So here we can see that Loukanes appears to have said, and how timely, speaking about the Pope today, just one day after his funeral. So for that Pope, Leo X, we have Nikolaos Loukanes say the following words. Should I hope for a volunteer? Again? Is the font good? Can someone read maybe? Telio, okay.
Image, I don't think I didn't like. Leo, the image of God, Greece, as decreed by God, sends me to address you as the foremost guardian of her freedom.
Τέλεια. Πάρα πολύ ωραία. Thank you so much. So you can see here the idea that the Pope could wield the immense influence of his spiritual authority to unite all the Christian powers against the Ottomans. This is something that we can see here, but it was hardly new. In the years immediately preceding Loukanes' birth, the Second Ottoman-Venetian War had turned Zakynthos into a major safe haven for refugees arriving from the captured nearby cities of Nafpaktos, Methoni, and Koroni. But still no concerted attempt to halt the seemingly inexorable Ottoman advance was in sight. A series of fierce wars for control over Italy, known as the Italian Wars, had plunged Europe into a seething political and military maelstrom with immeasurable consequences not only for Western, but also, and much to the consternation of Greek scholars, for Eastern affairs. In 1508, Ianos Laskaris, who had been appointed as the French ambassador to the Serenissima, had prepared a detailed plan for a crusade. But on the eve of the League of Cambrai, with its disastrous outcome for the Republic of Venice, the timing couldn't have been more inopportune. It was not until the elevation of Giovanni di Lorenzo de' Medici, this is Leo X, to the papal throne on March 19, 1513, that hopes for the liberation of Greeks were imbued with new life and vitality. So enough about the historical background. Now we will turn to the Iliad itself, Loukanes' Iliad. And before we begin, I want you to listen to something that is going to make you feel that summer has arrived together with the weather. So are you familiar with the Paraklesis? In August, right? The first 15 days of August. So I will play for you, and hopefully you will be able to listen to it, an excerpt from the Paraklesis, and specifically the Exapostillaria. I know we have some people who chant here, right? So I will play this part from someone who is really charismatic. I don't know if you know his name, Fotios Ketsentzis. And let's see how this can be connected to our Iliad. Είναι Φώτιος Κετσετζής. Φώτιος Κετσετζής. Είναι άρχοντας πρωτοψάλτης, βέβαια, also a professor of Byzantine chanting for many, many years at the Theological School in Boston. Είναι εξαιρετικός. He is amazing. So what does that have to do with our Iliad, you think? As I mentioned, Homer's Iliad is composed in dactylic hexameter, right? So this is the meter that was used in the Iliad. But the meter Loukanes is using is trochaic octosyllable. And specifically, he is using pairs of trochaic octosyllables. Where do we find these specific choices? Byzantine music, and specifically laments, but also prayers like this one. So, of course, Nikolaos Loukanes is borrowing the verse from another Byzantine author. We can say that he's the first one to make this choice, but still, the way I felt when I first read Loukanes' Iliad was that the rhythm, it reminds me of something. So instead of reciting the Iliad, it is as if someone is chanting, almost chanting the Iliad. It sounds like a prayer, but also like a lament. And we shouldn't forget that this is a period after the fall of Constantinople, right? The fall of Constantinople in 1453. So now we are in 1526. How do these people feel? They no longer have the Byzantine Empire, but they still want to preserve something. And how do they identify? And they want to have the Iliad as the first text that they want to publish in Venice. They have their own publishing press, and this is their choice. They are printing the Iliad in a luxurious edition, and they are also printing orologia, many books about the Greek liturgy. So let's talk more about Loukanes' book. This Renaissance epos is a condensed version of the original, written in a so-called κοινή γλώσσα. Now, when we say κοινή γλώσσα, this is not the κοινή used in the Gospels. This is a different language. It is interspersed with some archaic elements too, because Loukanes is very intentional with what he is doing. He wants to have a language that will be able to be as good as the Iliad itself. He needs to do something that is really, really unique. So it is written in κοινή γλώσσα, in pairs of trochaic octosyllables, and it is addressed to a wider, mainly Greek-speaking audience residing in the Greek East or abroad. Usually, Loukanes follows the original quite closely. He wants to be very faithful to the original. As for the omitted material, when it does not include extensive similes or protracted speeches, our author is usually careful to offer a synopsis of its content, covering the basic events of each book. Given the author's marked predilection for precision, it is all the more surprising to see that his rendition swerves considerably from its source in the representation of the Trojans and the Achaeans, because we should remember that back then in the Iliad, we don't have the appellation Greeks. We have Achaeans, we have Danaans. This is how they would identify. In the remaining part of this presentation, I will offer an example of Loukanes' willfully denigrating portrayal of the enemies. Of course, there are many more, but the brevity of this presentation would not allow me to discuss all the instances. Suffice it to say that the Trojans in the Iliad are portrayed in a very positive way. They are brave, or we have just merely descriptions about them, but nothing that is negative as a characterization of the Trojans. In gauging the possible motives underpinning the author's metaphrastic choices, I will attempt to elucidate the significance of theories developed already in medieval times and widely revived during the Renaissance period regarding the origins of the Turks and the alleged association of the latter with the Trojans. Finally, I will conclude the analysis by proposing that Loukanes is retrojecting the rivalry and animosity that existed between the Greeks and the Ottoman Turks in the 16th century into the decidedly un-jingoistic heroic past reflected in the Iliad. Early on in his work, and maybe we can continue with the next slide. Perfect. The author introduces the opponent's territory as the land of the barbarians. When King Agamemnon, addressing the assembly of the Achaeans, appears despondent over the failure of his army's 9-year endeavor to capture the city of Troy. While Homer's Agamemnon speaks with reverence and awe of the well-peopled city of Ilion, the same hero in Loukanes' Iliad has nothing but contempt for the land of the barbarians. And once again, maybe I need a volunteer to read. Maybe in English. Ωραία, τέλεια, τέλεια. Ναι, both Greek and English. Όποιο θέλετε.
Oh, right, thank you. But there are allies from many cities, men who wield the spear, who hinder me greatly, and though I wish it, do not allow me to sack the well-peopled city of Ilios.
Ακριβώς, you see, this is the Iliad itself. Well-peopled city of Ilios. But with Loukanes, and allow me to read in Greek, «Έστιγαρ εσχήνει τόδε εις τους άπαντας ανθρώπους, τόσους χρόνους να σταθόμεν εις την χώραν», can you notice here, «των βαρβάρων και συχνά να πολεμόμεν κι άπρακτοι εις τας πατρίδας να στραφόμεν ως γυναίκες». So, not the well-peopled city of Ilios. A striking difference. Here, we are confronted with a largely post-Herodotian distinction between civilized Greeks and uncouth foreigners that is anachronistically applied to the temporarily elusive, legendary world of heroes that is so imaginatively recreated by Homer in his epic. As we may recall, in the Iliad, the epithet Varvaros is used only once for the Carians in the compound form Varvarophony to denote merely a linguistic difference. It was not a cultural thing back then. In Constantine Hermoniakos' 14th century rendition of the Trojan story, from which Nikolaos Loukanes borrows profusely in certain sections of his work, the roles are reversed. In a scene where some of the most despicable Trojan War atrocities are poignantly described, the epithet Varvary is applied to the Greeks. It is also worth noting that Hermoniakos' version does not include any pejorative remarks whatsoever about the Trojans. So we are moving away from Hermoniakos with Loukanes, and we are also moving away from the original, the Iliad itself, Homer's Iliad. But if Loukanes' Iliad does resonate to a significant extent with Hermoniakos' Iliad, to the point that Hermoniakos' work is considered to be its second source besides the Homeric Iliad, the question then naturally arises: why is Loukanes so willing to veer away from both of his main sources in his depiction of the Trojans? Is he wittingly investing the Trojan legend with an incipient national sentiment? Does his view of the present color his perception of the past? And why do the inhabitants of the famed fortress town of Hellenic in his work bear an uncanny resemblance to the Ottoman Turks? 15th century theories on the origins of the Turks, drawing on material from the medieval chronicle tradition, will greatly help to elucidate all these questions. And with that, let's move to the next slide, please. The story of the Turks' alleged Trojan origins goes back to the late 7th century and has its roots in a Latin chronicle, which is commonly ascribed to a fictitious author, Fredegar. According to the legend, attested for the first time in this source, after the fall of Troy and during the ensuing flight from the famed city, Trojan refugees were split into two groups. The first group fled to Macedon, and through intermingling with the pre-existing local population, gave rise to the people of the Macedonian kingdom of Philip II and Alexander the Great. The second, meanwhile, meandered for many years through Asia Minor, before finally settling into Europe under the leadership of King Frankio, a potentate these people had elected for themselves. Following the description of the birth of the Frankish nation, the account centers on the peregrinations of a sub-branch of the previous group, which, deciding to secede from the main body of the Franks and designating its own sovereign, Torquatus, eventually anchored itself along the banks of the Danube between the Ocean and Thrace. On the basis of Fredegar's report, these are the forebears of the nation of the Torki. Though it is quite precarious to argue that the author intended to refer to any historical Turkic people, and despite the fact that Fredegar's tale was largely eclipsed by subsequent chronicles, the semi-dormant theory of the Trojan pedigree of the Turks held on tenaciously until the Renaissance. To be sure, by that point, the majority of humanists seriously engaged in historiographic work strenuously rejected any such connection, promoting instead the theory of a Scythian descent of the Turks. This is what people in the West, the scholars, they wanted to say, the Turks have a Scythian descent. They do not come from the Trojans, which was entirely in keeping with the prevalent contemporary conceptualization of the Ottomans. Foremost among them was the prolific Aeneas Silvio Piccolomini, Pope Pius II, who, upon ascending the papal throne in 1458, fully devoted himself to arduous preparations for an ambitious crusade project, which, much to his distress, would never materialize. His writings are brimming with reproaches against those who irresponsibly referred to the Turks as Tefkri, the name by which the Trojans were widely known in the West, through Virgil's Aeneid. Aside from the tenuous medieval evidence, there were mainly three reasons why these ethnonyms were often used interchangeably. The first, pertaining to an unmistakable phonetic resemblance between the names Tefkri, this is how they were known, the Trojans in the West, and Turki. Tefkri, Turki. Είναι πολύ κοντά. Ακριβώς, it's very close. The second reason, to the humanist penchant for achieving an authentic antique style, purged of barbaric neologisms. And the third, to the identity of the Turks' power base in Asia Minor. To be sure, not all humanists employing the term Tefkri for the Turks were doing so because they were intent on making a statement about the true origins of the latter. What about those instances, however, where the Turks were explicitly portrayed as relentless avengers who, by capturing Constantinople, were requiting the grave injustices inflicted upon Troy in eras long gone? The notion is tangibly reflected in numerous accounts of the fall of Constantinople. Filippo da Rimini, for example, the Venetian chancellor of the island of Corfu, in his description of Constantinople's siege, narrated how upon entering Constantinople, the Sultan defiled a Greek virgin who had taken refuge in the church of Hagia Sophia. Why did he do that? In retaliation for Cassandra's rape by the Locrian Ajax. Speculating on the veracity of such statements is not always easy. On many occasions, the downfall of Troy and the ensuing sufferings of its inhabitants were thought to be the perfect foil for the atrocities committed during the sack of Constantinople, and therefore authors were inclined to employ the Trojan analogy mainly as a rhetorical device to dramatically accentuate the poignancy of the demise of the Byzantine Empire. Let's move to the next slide, please. Yes, this one, thank you. The Responsio Magni Turci, a spurious epistolary poem purportedly composed by Mehmed II in response to an authentic letter written by Pius II for the purpose of evangelizing the Grand Turk, further encapsulates the essence of the theory of the Trojan origins of the Turks. In this highly imaginative piece of anti-papal propaganda, the Sultan expostulates with the Pope, protesting that the Trojan heritage should not be monopolized by Pius. So you see that here Mehmed, although the veracity of this has not been confirmed, this is a spurious, of course, letter, but let's see what Mehmed purportedly said, and this will be the last volunteer of the day. So now is your chance.
Anybody?
Ωραία, ωραία, ναι.
You wanna read?
Φυσικά, φυσικά. It is in English, so it is easy.
You have said it is impossible for me to be a Dardanian by birth, nor have you blushed to call me a Turk. I am a Teucrian born of Teucrian blood. Why, Pius, do you call me a Turk throughout your poem? Tell me who was Teucer and then who was Turcus. Father, we were Trojans, whatever you may think. We were the remnants of the nation of Priam, who the Greek generals could not destroy in their cruel war. History tells how powerful in war the Dardanians were. You should read your history.
You should read your history to the poem. Okay. So you see here, what is the issue? People like Pope Pius, they felt they are getting our own heritage. We are descended from the Trojans. We have this lineage. No, you cannot say that they are descended, that the Ottomans are descended. The Turks' right to their putative Trojan patrimony is asserted, as you can see, in the most powerful way. Taken at face value, this claim would seem to imply that the Ottoman sovereign truly entertained the belief that the Turks derived their pedigree from the Trojans. Would the Quattrocento audience, however, interpret it in such a way? An exhaustive discussion of the motives underpinning the humanist infatuation with the Turco-Trojan legend lies outside the purview of this presentation. Regardless of whether the Quattrocento authors were convinced of the validity of the Turks' Trojan ancestry or not, there is one thing that remains certain. The notion enjoyed considerable popularity throughout the 15th century, especially among scholars who wish to infuse a distinct antiquarian tone into their accounts of the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople. Ubertino Pouskolos' epic poem Constantinople, composed around 1455, offers a wonderful example of how the past was projected onto the present, since its hexameters are filled with references to the Turks as Tefkri and to the Greeks as Homeric Danae. Can you imagine? We are talking about the sack of Constantinople, and he's using Tefkri and Danae. If this humanist was apt to invoke the myth of the Trojan War in order to amplify the calamities visited upon Constantinople, was Nikolaos Loukanes reversely transposing the post-1453 Greco-Ottoman conflict into a more glorious, mythical setting with a view to inciting his fellow countrymen to emulate the sublime bravery of their forefathers? The above analysis has provided an example of how Loukanes' portrayal of the Trojans differs considerably from the Homeric account. Against the backdrop of continuing association of the Turks with the Trojans, these disparaging appellations, for which we find no parallel whatsoever in the Iliadic tradition, may be regarded as emblematic of an endeavor to graft the opposition between the post-Byzantine Greeks and the Ottoman Turks onto that between the Achaeans and the Trojans. in proudly identifying with the illustrious forebears, the Achaeans, and in evincing so pronounced a hostility toward the ostensible offspring of the Trojans, the Ottomans, Loukanes seems to echo the views espoused by some of the most influential members of the Byzantine intelligentsia in Italy, like Ianos Laskaris and Marcos Moussouros, and he was personally connected with these people. These intellectuals were fervent supporters of the idea that the pontiff could wield the influence of his spiritual authority to unite all the Christian powers in an expedition against the Turks, and did not miss any opportunity to proclaim in the most emphatic way the resolute willingness of the enslaved Greeks to recall their ancient virtues and to forcefully attack the enemy from within in order to behold the light of freedom shining once again on the Byzantine city. It is not known whether Loukanes' Iliad was primarily intended to galvanize its readers into action, inciting them to support the cause of a crusade against the Ottomans. But even if it did, the timing could not have been more unfortunate. During the uneasy summer of 1526, a few months after the publication of Loukanes' Iliad, the heavily defeated members of the Anti-Imperialist League of Cognac, deeply enmeshed in the ongoing conflict for domination over Italy, hardly had time to make plans about how to wrest Greece free from the Ottoman shackles. Thank you very much.
Any questions?
Professor, I don't know if you share my anger, but I was not an angry young man. I'm an angry old man. You know, I'm 87, 1 year younger than the Pope. But the thing is, in my old age, I've become very angry at these scoundrels who created my Greek nation that I was born 87 years ago. 100 years before, instead of taking the example of France and the American Revolution and which brought France and the colonial revolution brought Americans and the French 300 years ahead. But these scoundrels that created the nation of Greece that I was born in, they brought Greece 300 years back. And now they brought us, in 25 words or less, they brought us a foreign anti-Hellenic religion from the Middle East and make Greece a theocratic state, number one. And number two, they brought a young Germanic young man to make Greece a monarchy.
The king,
so instead of bringing Greece 300 years ahead, they would put Greece 300 years back. And this really angers me. How about you? How do you feel about it?
Isn't it very relevant? I mean, the theme of anger is exactly the theme of the Iliad. The first word with which Iliad begins, if you remember, what is it? Anger, sing to me, O muse. By the way, that muse was Calliope. So I feel privileged because my name is Calliope, although he's not referring to me, but still. Meaning, the Thea, sing to me the anger. So I feel that what we see in the Iliad, this anger of Achilles, the fact that they are not united, because you remember, of course, this incident between Achilles and who was the king of the Achaeans? Leading the expedition, Agamemnon. Okay. Agamemnon and Achilles, they do not agree. So personally, if you ask me, I feel that this harmony created by that internal strife or emphilios, these are truly calamities for our nation. And as you say here, united we stand, divided we fall. So I feel that when we are united in our vision as Greeks, as you are here, because I can see that you are united, when that happens, then we can see something great out of this ecumenical spirit of Hellenism. But thank you so much for the question.
Excuse me.
I can see, thank you very much. Great presentation. I mean, makes one think.
Mhm.
Okay. However, could you, in a few words,
Yes.
give the overplay of your presentation
Mhm.
that encompasses what? The thinking of the Latins at the time vis-a-vis the new, at the time, Greek emancipation in thought?
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Is that what it was? Was there any nefarious
Mhm.
background here that we're missing from the point of the Latins to belittle
Mhm.
the Greeks in general
Mhm.
by usurping the thought of the Iliad and using it against the people that were on a higher thinking point in the Latin community in general. I don't know if I'm making the point. I'm just worried about why the popes, why the
Mm.
Latins, why are they going through all this background
Mhm.
explanation of the Iliad.
Mhm.
Iliad at the time, if I understand,
Mhm.
and if I'm diverging, cut me off. So here is the Iliad that exists.
Mhm.
The 2 or 3 or 5 people that are totally emancipated within the Latin community, they understand what they read. They say, oh, what a great book, story. Let's put it in our society.
Mhm.
Here is the press that it was just developed, the press machine.
Mhm. Mhm.
Let's multiply it and let's pass it on. So all this is Latin. The Greek thinkers that take advantage of that. From there, what happens? I kind of lose you. I lose you
Okay.
because of the intricacy of your presentation. Your presentation was beautiful. I don't demean it at all. I
Oh,
loved it.
yes, of course.
And just my mind cannot comprehend how the balance is taking place. I'm sorry.
Yes, of course, of course. So, in a nutshell, the people in the West wanted to have the Iliad, and as you mentioned, that was mostly the scholars, right? They wanted to read Homer in the original. So that was part of the humanistic effort to rediscover culture and have this connection with that part of the heritage, the Greek heritage. They felt that they could use it in numerous ways. I mean, what is so interesting is that in the West, the Iliad could never play as important a role as it did in the Greek tradition. In the Greek tradition, it defines who we are. And whenever we want to exhort ourselves and say, we can do it, these are the forebears, we turn to it. It is one of the few texts that we have for all these years. In Byzantium, later on, we keep printing and reprinting it. It is important for our identity. To the West, it would never get this specific significance. They had a different epos that defined them, but they did it culturally because they felt that being inspired by Homer, they would be able to write poems in a much better way. And, you know, many times that makes me think also of this appropriation of the cultural heritage, and specifically Homer. You must be familiar with Άγιος Ιωάννης, ο Χρυσόστομος, St. John Chrysostom, right? These fathers, at some point, they were faced with a specific decision. What are we going to do with the classical tradition? Some people said, no, we don't want it. These are pagans. Take it away from us. But thank God, the church fathers, they decided to keep it. And why did they keep it? Because they felt that like bees, they would go to Homer and select the parts that they wanted from Homer. That was mostly something stylistic. It would make them even better authors. So they had entirely different aspirations. People in the West, the Pope, right? They wanted to bring the Renaissance, to bring all these texts. They were thirsty for knowledge. For us, it was not just something cultural. We had that, and we preserved it. It was preserved thanks to Byzantium, and we should be very proud of that. But it was really crucial for our collective identity. After the fall of Constantinople, this is how we can continue well, maybe it would be premature to say as a nation, because this is not the Enlightenment, but we would have some continuity, some form of continuity. Βέβαια, ναι, this is something that happens systematically with Adamantios Korais, his library. What is he doing? He is publishing certain texts. Now, these Greeks from the community of Venice, they are establishing publishing presses, and they start producing these texts. Why? One of the friends of Nikolaos Loukanes, Nikolaos Ofianos, he says somewhere, because we want this nation to grow wings again, να αναπτεριγιάσει το γένος των Ελλήνων. So we have, of course, many differences with the Enlightenment, but mutatis mutandis, with all these differences being considered, still we can say that we have some things that are similar in a way, a similar effort. Yes.
I had a Costa, I had one question. I was just wondering at this point in the time period covered by your lecture, was there anything in terms of a Roman identity that had lasted, that had continued after the fall of Constantinople? And would they have suppressed that, the Greeks in Venice, so they could make the ties back to the glorious antiquity, but also maybe not to offend, because the term Roman, I don't know if it was being claimed or in the West at that point, but can you speak about any lingering Roman identity for the Greeks, Greek speakers from the East?
Of course. What an amazing question, and so much to the point. Now, if I ask you, how do you identify? And if I say Romni, does that tell something to you in your heart? Romni? You like it? Ωραία. So this specific characterization, and you know, by the way, when we talk about the Byzantines, we call them Byzantines now, but they identified as Romans. They never said, I am Byzantine, all these emperors. They said, I am Roman. And the same is true for the people in the Byzantine Empire. You are absolutely right. The Roman identity persists. At some point after the first sack of Constantinople, 1204, we have the first sack of Constantinople. So what happens there is something truly intriguing. We are being denied the identity of the Romans by the people in the West because they say, no, we claim this identity. Come on, we also have Constantinople. You are not Romans, we are Romans. You are, and this is how it started, this term, Greki, this is a term that they used for us. So they said, no, you are Greeks, you're not Romans. Well, yes, we can say about the Hellenic culture that was very much part of who we were over the centuries. But at the same time, we were Romans, right? So you are absolutely right. This is something that started even earlier than that. But especially after the first sack of Constantinople, it became even more prominent to the point that, the intellectuals, the scholars, they said, we need to do something about it. And they were trying to preserve both the Roman identity as they had for all these years and the Hellenic identity. Nice. So this is a wonderful question.
Yeah, that's okay. I think I can for the recording. For the recording. Okay. The Byzantines, did they know where the Turks came from? Because here there is a confusion. They call them with the Trojans, etc., etc. I understand that the Latin people far in the west, they did not have the proximity that the Byzantines had with the Turks, and they may not know. But I suppose that the Byzantines, they should know where they came from because they were fighting them for many, many years, hundreds of years, actually.
Yes.
So did they know where the Turks came from?
Yes, there were beliefs for the Byzantines. When they are writing historiography, what is tricky, has anyone read any Byzantine historian? So there is this tendency from Byzantine historians not to use a current name when they are referring to the people. They are using an ancient name. So indeed, they were not saying Turks, Ottomans. Well, not Ottomans back then. There weren't Ottomans previously in the Byzantine Empire. They are mostly saying Scythes, Perses. They are using ancient names. They are not using Trojans.
But were they, I understand it, but they were aware that they were not even Persians.
Yes.
They were.
No, they were conscious of that. And of course, I have also written some articles where I go into detail, but imagine, I know it was intricate because it is a complicated subject. I couldn't bring everything together, but I have written articles where you can go and see in detail what were the epithets that Byzantines were mostly using for the Turks. And of course, they were convinced that these people didn't come from Troy.
Sure.
But this specific kind of identification, for some reason, it emerged again with the fall of Constantinople and with these authors that were trying to present the capture of Constantinople as a story of revenge, that, they are taking back that city as many years ago the Greeks had sacked Troy. In a way, it became very prevalent
Yeah,
again.
yeah, but when they try to connect with the Trojans, the Turks,
Mhm,
actually Troy fell,
mhm.
but Constantinople also fell.
Yes,
So it was on the side of the losers, not on the side of the winners.
exactly. But if you are trying to give something to the people that will be hopeful, when you are doing that, you are retrojecting a heroic past, and that past is victorious. So it can be again victorious.
Yes, I understand it, but
Probably. And of course, that led later to go back to your question to maybe the Megali Idea and the other politicians. But
the Trojans, they never resurrected. So
yes.
yes, when you try to say the resurrection of the nation,
Mhm.
connecting with the Trojans, they had disappeared. Actually, the Romans, they were saying that they may come. Ο Αενίας ήταν από την Τετρίνια κλπ.
In that sense, they became a thriving community again. And this is why the Aeneid is so important for the West and for how they perceive of themselves, because that was the story of the victorious Trojans, which means the Romans, the ancient Greek Romans, not
The victorious Trojans in what sense? Because the Trojan fell. I mean, they were not. Oh, you may say
they had a
that they left.
thriving, yes, they had a thriving empire later on, the Roman Empire.
Okay, the continuation
The
was the Roman
continuation.
Empire.
Yes, because according to that tradition in the West, the Aeneid is the main story, right? That they have. At some point, almost every nation in the West wanted to identify as the Trojans, that they had a Trojan pedigree.
Okay.
Why is that?
So
Because
that in that
of the
sense,
Roman.
when we're trying to convince the Latins to support the Greeks, because the Turks, who are the Trojans, it seems a bit contradictory, because if the West was identifying with the Trojans and you are asking them to fight the Turks, which they are the Trojans, they would not,
Who-
they
who-
would not come to your side.
Yes, but we shouldn't forget that this specific Iliad was addressed mostly to the Greeks.
Yeah, but I had the impression that Loukanes wrote it in order to get the sympathy of the West.
I would say that most of these efforts, apologies if there was some kind of misunderstanding, these texts, because now we talk about modern Greek, right? People in the West, yes, indeed, they started reading them, but these were not intended mostly for the audience in the West. They had their liturgies, books of orologia that were published. These publishing presses, they were producing books primarily for Greeks, not for the West.
Okay,
It
so
was a
the
totally
audience of
different
Loukanes
thing.
were the Greeks of the West, of the diaspora.
Yes, for the Greeks of the diaspora, Greeks in Venice, in thriving communities, merchants, but also
Okay,
No, no.
I understood it that he was trying to get the sympathy of the West and to encourage them to have a crusade against the Turks, etc., etc.
There were, I would say that there were concerted efforts on the part of, let's say, Giannos Laskaris, Marcus Musou, to be very close to the Pope, because they wanted to influence him, right? But they were doing it in a totally different way.
Okay.
Marcos Mousouros, for example, he wrote a hymn to Plato. And this is what he is addressing to the Pope specifically. It is written in very difficult Greek, Homeric Greek almost. That's how they would talk to these people. So that was an effort, but they wouldn't do it with, of course, Loukanes' efforts. These were intended for the Greeks, but still, that would be something that would help the Pope, especially if they wanted to have a crusade. And we know that Ianos Laskaris had a detailed plan about a crusade. In this specific detailed plan, he says, if you help us, know that people in Greece are going to support you because they really want their liberation. So in that greater scheme of things, yes, this specific book could make them remember where they come from and be proud.
So the term the Renaissance of Greeks, the West, is in the sense of the Renaissance among the Greeks of the diaspora in the West, and trying to keep their identity.
Yes.
Okay, because I understood it differently. I understood it as trying to encourage the West to study the Greeks, etc.
Yes, that was also.
It was true, yes, but specifically for what Loukanes did, if what he did in his Iliad, he was addressing the Greeks of the West and not the Latins, then it was like a renaissance of the Greek identity among the Greeks of the West.
Yes, and among, hopefully among the Greeks in general. It is exactly, I mean, if you think about the school that Nikolaos Loukanes attended, this specific school for the Pope, it was wonderful because indeed they would have a renaissance of Hellenism culturally, and they did that in all the letters that these scholars addressed to the Pope and to all these other people. They did that too. So it was that, but at the same time, there were urgent needs about Greeks. And what they were primarily interested in was the preservation of their identity. So both happened.
Okay.
Yes, both.
I understand. Any other question? Very good. Thank you very much. Great
Okay.
you saying this.
Ah,
Thank you.
yes.
Oh, that's another one?
Excuse me, we have two chat questions that came in from two people who are including Stefano. So I'm going to read them and 1 second.
Yes. Yes. 16th century is Renaissance, definitely, yes. Post-Byzantium, post-Byzantine, and this is the Renaissance.
Okay, the question we have from Kostas Della Georgios. Could you discuss that not only did the Ottomans see themselves as descendants of the Trojans, but also Ottoman sultans saw themselves as successors to the Roman Empire?
This is a wonderful question. This is something that is happening after the fall of Constantinople in 1453. We do have, on the one hand, the Ottomans who claim this to be the people who will continue that Roman Empire, and who else you think might have similar claims to? It is Charlemagne, yes, absolutely. But I mean, later on, Russia. Russia is that Orthodox empire where they have preserved the religion as well. Yes, what happens is that after the fall, the Turks, what are they doing, the Ottoman Turks? They say, okay, we are going to have the patriarch, and the patriarch is going to be the leader of this community. This community, and they were called Rams, the Greeks who resided in these areas, Asia Minor. So their identity according to the Ottomans, is a religious identity mostly, and this is something that has been discussed extensively by a very well-known scholar who will be coming to give a talk to us. If you are here, please come. Paschalis Kitromilidis. He will give a talk about that at some point in the fall. So yes, this is definitely a claim that they have.
Okay, and the last question from Stefanos. Did the Greek scholars that moved to Italy embrace the Latin Catholic Christian doctrine? Can you comment on Greek theologians of the time that were vehemently against the Pope and view that approach as treason? I think he's in parentheses actually preferring the Ottoman subjugation to the papal domination.
Exactly. I know exactly, Kyria Stephanie, I know exactly what you're referring to. All these discussions started even before the fall of Constantinople. In the Byzantine Empire, as you may know, that empire was dwindling. It was shrinking. They didn't have wealth. They were trying to get some help, right? Some emperors famously went to the West to try to find these specific collaborations that would help them. A good part of Byzantines back then, even before the fall of Constantinople, considered that as treason.
Yes.
So needless to say that for some scholars in the East, indeed, that was a treason. But you know, what is really interesting about Nikolaos, Loukanes, Ianos Laskaris is that we have a letter. We have a letter that Marcos Moussouros sent back to their parents, the parents of these kids who went in Rome. And you know what he says, which is so interesting? We are preserving the Roman customs. We are not eating eggs or cheese on a Wednesday or a Friday. We are preserving our orthodoxy through fasting. You may be familiar with that. So in this specific case with Pope Leo X, there was no such fear of telling them, oh, you need to convert, you need to become a Roman Catholic. But in Venice, where they really wanted to have their own church, they were struggling because they were saying, we don't want to go to a Roman Catholic church. We want to have our own priests who will come from, I don't know, from Crete, let's say. And Anna Komnini, you remember you have the Byzantine Empress. Later on, you have other people who come from nobility. And then from Constantinople, they need to go to these thriving communities. One of these ladies, Anna Paleologina Notara, she is persuading the people to come to her own house so that they can celebrate. This is before they have their church. Come to my house and we are going to have celebrate the liturgy in our own way. And all these books that they publish in Venice, you have the authorities checking to see whether they have filioque. Do they have filioque? You know, this controversy between the difference that the Holy Spirit comes from the Father and they say, and the Son. So they would see all these books that the Greeks in Venice were publishing, and they said, what are you publishing? You are heretics. Do you have the filioque inside? And they were always finding ways to trick them, to say, oh, we do have it. But they had the Orthodox way. So to them, it was, it took a lot of effort to have their own church, to preserve their identity. And even to this day, if you visit Venice, you can go to the church of San Giorgio dei Greci. And there is also an institute there. I feel that they were successful in preserving their identity with a lot of effort. This is highly likely. I know that the patriarch also went there. Yes, exactly. Because now, okay, yes, I really need to check that. I didn't have the opportunity to watch. No, but thank you so much for bringing that up.
Thank you, Professor Dourou, for coming and gracing us with your presence today. How about a nice round of applause for our speaker today?